The proverb of the melon and the knife presents a remarkably stark view of power dynamics, specifically the idea that in certain systems, the outcome for the vulnerable is inevitable regardless of the immediate cause. It's the central pillar of the satire found in the sayings of Hakeem Batli Bumboos, a fictional character who embodies the grumpiness and pseudo-wisdom often attributed to traditional herbalists in South Asian literature. This specific dialogue, where the Hakeem explains that whether the melon falls on the knife or the knife on the melon, the result is a ruptured melon, serves as a cynical commentary on societal structures where the weak always bear the brunt of the damage.
It's a classic setup for South Asian satire. You have this Hakeem, a traditional doctor who is supposed to be a figure of healing and profound insight, but he's portrayed as irritable, aggressive, and borderline nonsensical. The name itself, Batli Bumboos, sounds like a playful construction. Batley often refers to a bottle, and bambus sounds like bamboo or a stick, perhaps hinting at the crude tools of his trade or his tendency to threaten his apprentice with physical discipline. In Urdu literature, characters like this are often used to critique the stagnant nature of traditional authority.
It's fascinating how Hakeem Batli Bumboos encapsulates that archetype of the grumpy sage. In the snippet provided, he isn't just offering medical advice, he's laying down a harsh social reality. The metaphor of the melon and the knife is actually a very old proverb, appearing in various forms across Persian, Arabic, and even Chinese folklore. But the way he frames it, with those clear and loud words, it turns from a simple observation of nature into a biting commentary on inevitability. He's saying that in certain systems, the who and how don't matter as much as the structural reality that the melon, or the weaker party, is always the one to pay the price. It's deterministic and hilariously bleak.
And the dialogue with the disciple really drives home the absurdity of his authority. The student asks for safe passage, or aman, which is language you'd expect in a royal court, not a local pharmacy. Hakeem Batli's reaction is gold. He immediately calls out the pretension, asking if the student sees any executioners standing around. He's rejecting the formal, flowery traditions of the past, while simultaneously being a complete tyrant in his own right. It's a double-edged sword. He mocks the idea of being an emperor, yet he rules his matab or clinic with an iron fist, or in this case, a heavy pestle.
That tension is exactly where the comedy lives. The student's fear isn't entirely misplaced, though. He points out that the Hakim's wrong prescriptions could be just as lethal as an executioner's axe. This is a classic trope in Urdu satire, especially in the works of writers like Patris Bukhari or Mushtaq Ahmad Yusufi, where the traditional Hakeem is portrayed as a figure who is dangerously confident in his ignorance. By calling him Batli Bumboos, a name that sounds intentionally nonsensical and rhythmic, the author immediately signals that this is a caricature. A Batley refers to a bottle, and Bumboos sounds like a phonetic play on bamboo or something sturdy but hollow. It suggests a certain type of quackery wrapped in the dignity of a sage.
The technical breakdown of that melon proverb is worth looking at. In the original Urdu text, he uses the phrase Baz aukat muktalif surat-e-hal mein natija yeksan bi nikal sakta hai. This is his grand takeaway. He's intellectualizing the obvious. It's like a parody of deep philosophical insights. He's taking a physical reality, a knife cutting a soft fruit, and elevating it to a universal law of equivalent outcomes. It's the kind of logic used to justify why things never change for the working class or the melon of society. Whether the policy changes or the leadership shifts, if you are the melon, your stomach is the one that gets ripped open.
It also touches on the historical role of the Hakeem in South Asian society. Historically, Hakeems were polymaths. The word itself comes from hikmat, meaning wisdom. They weren't just doctors, they were philosophers, poets, and community leaders. But by the time we get to this kind of satire, there's a sense that the wisdom has curdled into ego. Hakeem Batli Bumboos is a Hakeem in name only. He uses his status to bully his student and dismiss legitimate questions. When the student gets so flustered that he actually forgets his question, the Hakeem doesn't help him. He just tells him to go back to packing purian, those little paper packets of powdered medicine. It highlights the repetitive, almost meaningless labor that sustains this facade of expertise.
The student's musamasi surat, that innocent or pathetic face, is such a specific image. It represents the perpetual subordinate. He's the one doing the actual work, the grinding and the packing, while the Hakeem sits back and drops these wisdom bombs that are essentially threats. The student's realization that a wrong prescription is a form of execution is actually a very sharp critique of the lack of accountability in these traditional systems. If the Hakeem makes a mistake, the patient dies, and the Hakeem just says it was fate. It's the ultimate knife and melon scenario, where the practitioner is the knife and the patient is the melon.
And let's look at the language he uses. Deus, Mardud, Jahil, these are heavy-duty Urdu insults. He's not just being a bit grumpy, he's verbally annihilating this kid. In a satirical context, this exaggeration serves to highlight the aggro effects, as some critics call it. It creates a subversive comedy where we laugh at the cruelty because it's so over the top. The Hakeem is a subversive figure because he's mocking the very idea of a safe space or a royal court. He's saying, "This is my clinic, get real." But in doing so, he becomes the very thing he's mocking, a petty despot.
Is there a broader cultural impact to these sayings of Hakeem Batli? They seem to belong to a tradition of fake wisdom literature. You see this in many cultures, the character who speaks in proverbs that sound profound, but are actually just descriptions of how the world is unfair. It's a form of coping, right? If you accept that the melon always gets cut, then you stop being surprised when things go wrong. It's a protective layer of cynicism.
Exactly. It's what theorists call the comedy of entrapment. The characters are trapped in their roles. The student can't leave because he needs to learn the trade, and the Hakeem can't stop being a jerk because that's where his power comes from. The irony is that the student's speed doubles at the end. The abuse actually works in a mechanical sense. It doesn't make him a better student, it just makes him a faster packer. It's a perfect analogy for how high-pressure, abusive environments prioritize output over actual understanding. The student isn't learning hikmat or wisdom, he's just learning how to survive the Hakeem.
But isn't there a risk that this kind of satire just reinforces the status quo? If we all just laugh and say, yeah, the melon always gets cut, aren't we just accepting that injustice as a natural law like gravity? The Hakeem is basically telling the student to stop asking questions and just pack the medicine. It's a very shut up and work message hidden under a veneer of folk wisdom.
That's a valid critique. Satire often walks that fine line. Is it exposing the wound, or is it just poking it for a laugh? However, by framing it as sayings of Hakeem Batli Bumboos, the author is clearly inviting us to mock the Hakeem. We aren't supposed to admire his wisdom, we're supposed to see through it. The absurdity of the name and the situation suggests that this universal law is actually a justification for laziness or cruelty. The Hakeem uses the melon metaphor to shut down the student's curiosity. It's a way of saying the result is always the same, so why bother asking why? It's the ultimate anti-intellectual argument delivered by a man who claims to be an intellectual.
The mention of the hound dasta, the mortar and pestle, is a great touch. It's the primary tool of the trade, used to crush herbs into powder. The Hakeem threatens to use it on the student's back. This literally turns the tools of healing into tools of harm. It's a visceral image that underscores the quack nature of the character. He isn't interested in the properties of the herbs, he's interested in the weight of the tool as a weapon. It's a complete inversion of the Hakeem's role as a healer.
It also highlights the unscripted feel of these satirical snippets. The way the conversation veers from a philosophical proverb to a threat of physical violence, and then back to pack the medicine, captures the chaotic energy of a busy, under-regulated 19th or early 20th century bazaar. There's a historical realism underneath the comedy. These clinics were often the first and only stop for the poor, and the Hakeem was a figure of both hope and terror. You hoped his prurian would work, but you were terrified of his temper and his bill.
Let's talk about the student's final reaction, his speed doubling. It's such a sad, funny ending. He doesn't get his answer. He doesn't get aman or peace. He just gets more work. It leaves the listener with this sense of a cycle. The student will eventually become a Hakeem himself, and he'll probably treat his own student the same way, quoting the same melon and knife proverb. It's a legacy of hikmat that is actually just a legacy of bullying.
And that might be the biggest idea here. The melon isn't just a person, it's the truth. In this environment, the truth gets cut no matter who is holding the knife. Whether you ask a question or stay silent, whether you try to be formal or casual, the power structure remains unchanged. The Hakeem represents the knife, arbitrary, sharp, and always in control of the narrative. The student is the melon, vulnerable, full of potential, but ultimately just something to be used or discarded. It's a masterful piece of micro-satire that uses a few lines of dialogue to map out an entire social hierarchy.
It's interesting how this specifically Urdu context adds flavor. Phrases like pangalena, taking a mess or picking a fight, give it a contemporary street-smart feel. Even if the setting is a traditional clinic, it suggests that Hakeem Batli Bumboos is a timeless character. You can find him in a modern office, a political talk show, or an old-school pharmacy. He's the guy who uses logic to silence dissent and tradition to avoid accountability.
If you look at the melon and knife proverb in other cultures, it's often more about caution. In Chinese, there's a saying, "Don't tie your shoes in a melon patch," meaning don't put yourself in a position where you look like a thief. But Hakeem Batli takes that melon and makes it about total inevitability. He removes the element of choice. For him, you're already in the patch and the knife is already coming. It's a much more noir take on the proverb. It's folk wisdom meets existential dread.
I think the takeaway for us today is to watch out for the Hakeem Batlis in our lives. Those who use metaphors to distract from their own incompetence or to shut down legitimate questions. The melon and the knife is a great metaphor for power, but it's also a warning. Don't let someone convince you that your stomach has to be the one that splits just because they say it's a law of nature. Sometimes the knife is just a tool in the hands of a quack, and the melon should probably find a new doctor.
That's a perfect way to put it. The satire isn't just about the Hakeem, it's about our willingness to accept his hikmat without questioning the Bumboos part of it. It encourages us to look at the surat-e-hal, the state of affairs, and realize that if the result is always the same, maybe the system itself is the problem, not the way the melon falls.
It really is a deep dive into the anatomy of folly, showing how human vanity and the abuse of authority can be dressed up as ancient wisdom. The dialogue effectively strips away that dignity, leaving us with a very human, very funny, and very frustrating scene that resonates far beyond the walls of a traditional clinic. If you enjoyed this breakdown of Hakeem Batli Bumboos and his sharp-edged philosophy, share this episode with someone who appreciates a good bit of satire.